I will be brief and direct. We have two major conflicts in the Central Asia, South Asia region, namely Afghanistan and Kashmir. And in my capacity as a journalist first, and now as an activist, as someone who's leading an NGO that is working with the youth, I had the opportunity to see very closely the situation of women in Afghanistan and in the refugee camps of the Afghans in the border regions of Pakistan, and also the refugees who are coming from Kashmir. Also had a chance to spend some time in Iraq a few years ago after the invasion, and followed that case also very closely and saw how the women there dealt with the situation. And I will be very direct with some of the findings. In the case of Afghanistan, I would say I was there in February in the refugee camps near the border, on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I saw one thing very clearly. Most of the refugees that came from Afghanistan came from communities that did not allow women many opportunities. But over a period of, let's say, almost 4 decades, because of the conditions of the refugee camps, the women, with the help of international aid workers, the NGOs, the United Nations definitely, they were able to sort of transcend some of the barriers that stop women normally from playing a proactive role in their society. So in the Afghan refugee camps, for example, you've had women who were mostly coming from the Pashtun community of Afghanistan, and it's a very conservative community. But I've seen, for example, a preponderance of educational programs or programs focusing on education, on teaching young girls to become teachers over a period of time, 5 years, 7 years. This led to, I would say, the production of a large number of teachers in that border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which was beneficial not only for the refugee camps there. It helped many families in terms of income, generating income, working in different schools. It also helped the host country, Pakistan, fill some gaps in terms of the availability of teachers to teach in these remote areas. So it was very beneficial. It served several purposes when women, a vulnerable section in the refugee population coming from Afghanistan, were helped in this way. And they did not face, these women did not face much resistance from their menfolk. Why? Because it was a benign activity, teaching the girls to become teachers in the future, and doing so in a way that would not would seem as if they're being westernized or they're being given Western education. No, it was a very indigenous local education. So this is a very successful example. The reason I'm mentioning it is I think it could serve as a model in many other places, especially now where you have across this greater Middle East region, you have societies that are quite similar to each other, and you have a large number of refugee populations right now erupting. We see that in Iraq, we see that in Somalia, we see that in other countries in Syria. So this is one example. In Kashmir, I think before I come to Kashmir, I would just quickly stop at Iraq. And in Iraq, it's a fascinating case. Why? Because the women of Iraq were, I would say, liberated before the conflict began in that country. The different governments that came to rule Iraq over the course of the 20th century were quite, I would say, enlightened. They encouraged education. Even under the government of a dictator like Saddam Hussein, the women were given priority in government jobs and scholarships. They were in important government positions in the private sector. So when Iraq entered into an era of conflict, first in the 1990s and then after the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq by the US, the Iraqi women were equipped and ready to play a very proactive role. And we've seen them do that in Jordan. We've seen them do that in Syria. And those of the Iraqi families that were able to find asylum in the West, in Europe in particular, and in the United States, were able to lobby for Iraq and various Iraqi causes. So that was a good example. But in contrast to these two examples, Afghanistan and Iraq, we have the example of Kashmir. In Kashmir, I would say, without hesitation, I think this is the only example of conflicts in this entire region, or maybe in the world actually, where you would find the largest number of women that have been subjected to sexual assault, and in particular rapes, as a tool of subduing the population by an occupation army. And as a result of that, I would say the largest and the most affected segment of the population in the Kashmir dispute or conflict are the women. And interestingly, in Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Afghanistan, there was a lot of devastation, a lot of instability, but there were some positive things as well, if you could term them positive. For example, the Soviet administration in Kabul tried to introduce certain social reforms, and those included impartial educational programs for girls and for women. In Iraq, for example, under the American occupation, there was an attempt made, maybe not very successful. An attempt was made to introduce education, and although the situation in Iraq is very, very grim, without a doubt, there are some pockets of success, very small, but there are some pockets of success in terms of provision of education in areas of Iraq that probably previously were neglected. In particular, I'm pointing out to southern Iraq that were neglected for over 30, since let's say late 70s by the government of Saddam Hussein. But in Kashmir, it's one very interesting example where the occupation administration makes it a point to target women, not men, not teenage boys who could resist or throw stones or join the resistance movement. No, women in particular. Why? Because women, it seems, women, they see women as the binding force in that Kashmiri society. And there's a tradition in the Kashmiri society where women have played, actually, unlike maybe other Muslim societies, where Kashmiri women have played a very active role in their social environment. They're targeting women because that's an easy way of suppressing both young men who want to join the resistance and to suppress their husbands or their fathers supporting the resistance movement as well. So women seems to be the easiest target. So it seems that in Kashmir there's a policy. Now, I was doing some research and I found out, for example, in the Indian Army finds this to be a very easy approach to sort of manage this military occupation. In 1958, they introduced a law called AFSPA. It's an Armed Forces Special Powers Act in 1958. That was 10 years after the Indian Army entered Kashmir and occupied it. And they started giving the soldiers special powers whereby they can get away with a lot of things, entering houses, arbitrary arrests, rapes in some cases. It seems to me that they found this experiment very successful. So in 1958, they introduced AFSPA, this law, and almost, let's say 30 years later, in 1972, they reintroduced a similar law in the northeast of India. I'm not sure if many of you know this. In the northeast of India, there's several insurgencies that are raging. These are mostly communist or leftist or Leninist insurgencies that ask for self-determination, and they want secession and separatism, basically. And a similar law was imposed there in 1972. So in 1958, the Indian Army experiments with this AFSPA law for 30 years, and they conclude it's a good law. Let's use it also in the Northeast. So in 1972, they use it for 10 years, And then a decade later, in 1983, Indian government and army faces another rebellion in a province called Punjab by the Sikh movement, which wants a separate homeland for itself called Khalistan. And so in 1983, the Indian government implements a similar law, FSPA type of law, in 1983 in Punjab. And in all the three cases, the only common denominator is the preponderance and a sort of a breakout of an epidemic called rapes under detention by Indian Army and Indian paramilitary forces. So I'm forced to conclude that this law was basically, a pillar of this law was rapes. And this has resulted, I'll come back to Kashmir, it has resulted in I think, one of the worst cases or worst conflicts in the world today for women. I doubt you